introduce people that are here from left to right. Mark Foster Gage, who's, I mean, everybody to some extent here has been involved with Columbia University. That's part of the reason why people are here and we are all here. Besides the fact that I'm introducing this book, before I introduce the panels, I wanted to say that at some point I realized, literally, that this book had so many contributors that have been a part of shaping Columbia University's identity on the last 15 or so years, or 20, I mean, which keeps changing and mutating, and yet includes it's the work that everybody in this panel has done and continues to do is embedded, and the work that is continuing to inflect its trajectory at Columbia. So I thought I came with this proposal to Mark to see if we could host this event here, which took place. Immediately had a good response to that, and suggesting that we also take the opportunity with this book presentation and symposium to informally discuss where Columbia is at now in terms of the digital technologies, in terms of the fluctuating trajectories of such, given that it had originated famously in the previous years. So that's partially what we're going to do here tonight. And with that, I wanted to introduce, again, Mark Foster Gage, who's a graduate from Yale, actually, but has been involved teaching at Columbia, co-teaching with people such as Design Couture and Hani Rashid, and then moving on to Yale with Greg Lin and a whole lot of people. He's also currently assistant dean at Yale. And his firm, Gage Clemenceau, has been doing amazing work. I wanted to introduce that as well. Immediately to Mark's left is Hernan Diaz Alonso. Hernan and I go really way back to Argentina, but he's definitely been a part of a lot of the energy that's been going on at Columbia in terms of digital work, and now is currently, for a number of years, he's been involved with SCIARC, but is now currently the chair of the graduate program at SCIARC. And I taught together in his studio, but I had the privilege of teaching with him that studio in 2004, and ever since he's been involved with Columbia University. Matias del Campo, also somebody that is not necessarily directly involved with Columbia, but we want to have him speak also in the ways in which this culture has somewhat moved to where he's at in Vienna. Matias del Campo, his firm's span is shared with his partner Sandra Manninger, and he's a graduate of the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, and he's a guest professor at the Dessau Institute of Architecture in Germany, as well as at the University International de Catalunya in Spain, and currently teaching as a visiting professor at Penn School of Design. To his left is David Ruiz. David is also he's a Columbia grad, and David is now an associate professor at Pratt Institute School of Architecture, and he has been involved at Columbia the way I actually first time I saw David ever in my life was he was teaching with Sanford Quinter in a studio where Hernan's wife, Florencia Pita, was involved. So it's all interesting, very interconnected here. And David also
our social life sucks.
It doesn't expand that much, right? Yeah. David's also been involved for the longest time with Penn, and currently consolidated his academic activities at Pratt. And we have Ferda, and David's practice is Rui Klein, his partner, Carol Klein. Ferda Kolatan, also I omitted to mention Mark Ben Clemens, who's Mark Gage's partner, who's somewhere around here, so for him not to kill me. Ferda Kolatan, a lecturer at Penn. Ferda his practice is SU11 with Eric Goldemberg, and he's also he's also a graduate at Columbia, has taught there at Columbia same way as David has. And Ferda and I have been competitors in the PS1 competition, and that's really always going to be a really great event. Yeah, I mean, nobody won though, so it's okay. I think the only person that ever won that thing here is Hernan, unfortunately. To the left of Ferda.
The important thing is that we all try.
Yeah, we can keep trying.
Yeah, but you don't get credit for trying.
Ultimately you do. At some point later.
But you had the pleasure of doing it.
And ruin it.
Galia, Solomonoff. I mean, I made sure to also kind of keep the conversation going with people that are currently teaching at Columbia University, so we can actually, generate this dialogue and whatever friction may come up or not. But Galia is supposed to actually mediate everything, because she's been around a long time with people that were part of what we consider the previous era at Columbia University, and currently an associate professor at Columbia. Galia's practice is called Solomonoff Architecture Studio, and she's been teaching there since 2006, correct? Mm-hmm. As well as teaching before in Cooper, Princeton, the works. Galia's been everywhere. And so glad to have you with us here. Also, David Benjamin, like myself, probably the youngest, or the most, not necessarily the youngest, but the most current graduates of everybody here. Graduated from 05 from Columbia, correct? And I graduated from 02 from Columbia. So I guess it's alumni night somewhat. And David's practice called The Living New York is shared with Sue and Young. And he's coordinator of special research labs at Columbia, and also somebody that can bring us to current perspectives of what's going on there. So with that, I would like to briefly, this night is about trying to position, given that we are here in New York, trying to position the kind of discourse of digital architecture somewhat connected to Columbia, somewhat connected to the recent history of such a Columbia, and foreseeing new possibilities. And I actually want to probably provide a certain focus, a certain lens to that with regards to what the work that is concentrated in this book. So I will just do a brief intro to that. Thank you so much, Nicola, for the pitch. Definitely, this book needs a download. And what actually I just run through some of the images, and some of the books are up there at the front. My intention with this book is just after being involved myself at Columbia, and also as a student and as a professor, to seeing how this culture expanded all over the place. Seeing how one can actually, as an after effect of what was initially an intense technique-driven set of studios originating with the paperless era, and then on to evolving into all sorts of interests, mostly around the issues of later on trying to begin to qualify what it is these techniques are for in terms of sensation, in terms of the architectural performance of works of this kind. I'm actually interested on now, as an after effect, observing how this work can be received, or how can this work be culturally received in a way that can substantiate a more ingrained relation to the practice of architecture, to the discipline of architecture. Not so much seen as something that happens as a kind of pseudo-avant-garde, but rather something that begins to be engaged with the larger discourse of architecture. My interest is on rhythmic perception, the ways in which one can actually look at this work and understand it from the point of view of how, after a certain concentrated period of experimentation with this work, now that that is set, there is known quantity, how can one look back at it and reformulate ways in which it can be perceived, ways in which it can be received culturally. My interest is in how, well, this was anecdotically, this which is here is another event like this one which started the book, which is called Digital Pulse, and it's done at the Florida International University in Miami, where I teach and coordinate the digital technologies, and a good number of people that are here were part of that event, along with Rahim, which may join later, and Jeffrey Kipnis. And this continues to be a way, connecting to that particular event, continues to be a way in which we try to look back at this work and step away from it. I am also included. as an author in a lot of this work. In one studio practice that is shared with my partner here, Veronica Salzberg. And I also have to kind of take the opportunity of writing about this work as a way of stepping out and trying to see how it should be received, or providing ways in which it could be understood and received. And my interest is particularly on how, given the intense deployment of digital technologies that we've been through and continue to do, how one can actually understand the intense, in a way, kind of work that seems to be about orientation, and works that seems to be in different ways engaged with the generation of digital form, as something that actually can be looked at and connected to our natural and innate capacity to perceive rhythms, right? Our innate capacity to psychologically apprehend rhythms. And a lot of this work, from the scale of micro ornament to the scale of urban strategies, one can definitely look at it from the point of view of how rhythms play out and how rhythms actually naturally involve one, as we are with rhythmic devices. We operate like that. And the point is that in a way, this work can easily be understood, or somewhat can be understood, as a projection of such into the real world. And to the point of view that, to the point that, in a way, the kind of affect that is generated now between the work that we do and the way in which it can be perceived, is really a very active feedback loop, whereby the work, it is itself rhythmical and demands, in a way, that you are tuned to it. In a way, what I'm suggesting also is that this kind of 10 or 15 years of extreme or intense period of discovery, experimentation with digital technologies has possibly generated a kind of new tuned way of perceiving the work from everybody. In a way, one is now prepared to look at this work and not receive it as some kind of exotic piece, but rather it's possible that one can actually assimilate naturally the activities that are going on in it through a kind of rhythmical lens. And that's kind of the assumption. And that is related in all sorts of ways to it's my understanding, to the Art Nouveau and to other, there's a kind of lineage to this work that connects that level of ornament as a kind of, not necessarily decor, but as a kind of intense, intricate deployment of connectivity that actually can be, can be assimilated to some of the work that we do, but in fact, the interesting aspect of the digital practice is how they operate, how one now, after qualifying them as works that actually operate at the level of sensation or atmosphere, now one is able to see what is next, or one is able to wonder and question what is next in terms of how they operate, how one can operate architecturally within these techniques. Beyond, assuming that they produce a kind of effect that is now beyond novelty, but definitely can be reintroduced to a discipline as something that is there to continue to question the ways in which we relate to the work via perception. So I'm flipping through some of the images, which some of them are iconic. These are the first part of the book up until now, just consolidates that which happened at the conference, the Digital Pulse conference in Miami. And the second part now moves on to what I call extended Pulse, whereby we have a lot of other contributors that are practicing. One of the other interesting aspects of the work, first of all, of course, it owes a certain gratitude or a certain kind of lineage to the kind of autonomy of the architectural practice establishment, first established. I mean, without this work, not specifically this work, but the kind of lineage of works produced by Peter Eisenman, we wouldn't even have in some of these discussions. So, I mean, he's also included in this book as a kind of external, establishing a kind of lineage for this kind of work. Although a lot of people may disagree and kind of even get into fights with Peter. But I think that it is undeniable that his contribution has influenced a lot of these people directly or indirectly. And I'm also including this as kind of personal, rare other contribution to a lineage of this kind of investment of complexity in form and kind of investment with linear forms. The work of Eric Diaz, who completely predates the digital work, but in more than one way, influenced a kind of obsession for a necessary obsession to find the right techniques beyond a certain threshold of two-dimensionality. But I think moving on, there's some iconic people here that have been an essential part of what was going on at Columbia and that continue to expand it there. I mean, what is interesting is also to see how people like here, like Jesse Reiser or UN Studio, I mean, it's interesting to see how there's been a certain curve of maturity of work that started as speculative digital work, even with the case of Asymptote, Hani Rashid, and Design for Tour, where their work started as a kind of more experimental investment with digital technologies, and nowadays it's really focused on an active practice. There's a kind of natural curve of such a generation of practitioners, and we have at least 3 different generations of people on this book. It's kind of interesting to also see where they are at the different curves of their practices. and I will actually...
Hernan, we save you a chair and big knees
yes,
and
please. It's the right time to have Hernan join. Thank you so much for coming as well. Hernan Columbia needs almost no introduction. It's been the Dean of Columbia University, kind of founding a lot of these systems as well, or kind of at least not being on the way of these systems. And this is, we're seeing more of these kind of what I call the intermediate generation that now continues to develop their kind of movement into practice has continued to generate a lot of technology, kind of continuously challenging and pushing the envelope in terms of the necessary technology that is required to develop these works, which ultimately what is interesting to see is also in the path of everybody is involved in this panel, how a lot of this work starts with installations and the kind of scale related to the kind of necessary scale related to the body in space, in the ways in which such involvement can grow up and be invested in the space. And of course, without digital fabrication, none of this work would be even entering the practice. And the work that continues to be now questioned, the kind of work that started as a purely speculative digital practice now has, in another stream of work, has evolved to really researching fabrication techniques and being able to kind of, still is a difficult transition moving from the scale of installations onto the scale of larger architectural constructs. But we have several examples of that that are actually moving up in the scale without abandoning whatsoever a kind of positioning within a kind of radical pursuit of digital generated forms. But what comes to, what continuously comes to mind is how this work that is really involved with what I call the rhythmic perception, it just, what it is to me, it's just the interest in putting all of this work in one book, which doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's under the same umbrella. It's about trying to define a kind of sensibility that necessarily, I mean, it's undeniable that it's related to a kind of recent history of where this activity came from, as it's spawned from Columbia University and on to many other institutions. But as it takes its own path, we see how this work moves through other institutions and moves through the different experiments in practice to assume very discrete identities. I mean, one of the things that come, the striking images in looking through this book, flipping through this book, is how one can somewhat assimilate these words and say, and try to call it something. But on the other hand, what really comes to mind is how striking the differences are between these practices, how a certain curve of maturity beyond the technique and beyond the kind of particular obsession with digital production has led to a kind of formulation of much more specific identities within the work, which continue to feed back in where they were originally from. This is actually where I actually like to leave it, and I will join my house. And what I would like, I mean, given that it's extraordinary that Bernard has joined us, and I appreciate it very much. And one of the ways in which we could start this conversation is perhaps Bernard can actually help us in trying to trace back a little bit of where this work started at Columbia, and what was the climate in which some of these pioneer work started, let's say with Greg, with Jesse Rice, with Kenny, and seeing now that you are still involved in Columbia, teaching at Columbia, but you have had this kind of distance to the work in a way. How do you see the status quo in a way at this point?
You're asking two questions.
Yes.
Right? One about then and the other one about now. So let's start about then. I always thought that, in the mid-19th century, when the elevator was invented, it completely changed the nature of something that already existed. In other words, towers had existed for thousands of years. But inventing the elevator suddenly completely changed the type. When in 1994, 1995, we thought, hey, maybe that tool, at the time one looked at it purely as a tool, could be brought into the studios, something might happen. But of course, nobody had any idea that what would happen. Namely, so we got a lot of machines. We were lucky enough to be able, to get them free, practically. Softwares and things of this sort. And someone invented that name, the paperless studio, which is a brilliant idea, brilliant name. We've never produced as much paper ever since. So the question was, nobody knew how to use the machines, right? Nobody had done that. But some people were more, ready to explore stuff. And among them were people that you all know here, like Greg Lim, Stan Allen, Hani Rashid, and what's the name of Karen Fairbank's partner? No. Scott Marr. Sorry. So I asked them to take over the first paperless studios. And they barely knew how to use the stuff. So, but within weeks, you would walk up, and those of you who know Avery Hall, it was all 700 level at the top. You would walk there, you would look at the screens, and you would immediately know who was doing what. Greg immediately had found out that all the architectural softwares were absolutely useless and went into, fluid mechanics softwares and started to, fiddle around, just play with it. Hani, who at the time was quite young, still in, from his Cranbrook days, he was really into surrealist collage, so he was doing Photoshop, strange stuff. Scott Marble was absolutely into zooming through, using some of the existing softwares. In other words, everyone, and Stan was doing datascapes. They were doing very much what they were doing in any case, but using the machine as a mode of accelerating, not process, but thinking. And of course, it's been a long way from that, but you just said something that I thought was really interesting. You used the word sensibility. So of course, over a period of years, people really got good at it and started even to play different ways, disagree with one another. But indeed, they shared a common sensibility. And then you got, the people who were really good at it, like some of the people around on this path, right? What interests me about this issue of sensibility is what does it, cover? What does it hide? And whether it's about something that can be defined, and that's probably not exactly what it is. A sensibility is just before you can define it. At the same time, it's not only about what it looks like, it's about what it wants to say. It's a way to apprehend the world. It's a way to grasp the world we are in. And when I flicked through the book, which I think is absolutely great, right? It covers a lot of territories, intelligently put together. So I started to ask myself, hey, now, if I say, like philosophers say, that the world is made of concept, percepts, and affects, right? I see a lot of percepts, fantastic images. I see a lot of affects. In other words, that's really, you don't necessarily understand, but you're drawn to it. It's a sort of form of experience. And then I ask myself, is that what is going to build the concept? In other words, the way to apprehend reality, the reality of the world we are in. And I think that's exactly the time we're at, right? In other words, is what will the new concepts of our world, including architecture, be as a result of all the research, all the fantastic research which is being done. So the question that I asked to everybody, what do you see as, the concepts of tomorrow or, in the making today?
I think that as you're, I appreciate very much describing the kind of energy that went on into foraging into something that is really unknown. And that, of course, has I've seen how a lot of the work of who we are here, and also a lot of the work of it's just Greg, Jesse Rice, and everybody that's also covered in this book, how that kind of friction, when you see the works and you look at the projects and you can recognize more or less how certain techniques were being explored, and where in some cases perhaps to the detriment of what one call an architectural exploration of architectural ideas, whereby not necessarily to the detriment, but we're privileging technique over privileging the kind of pursuit of an effect once technique is really known, experimented with enough, seems to sometimes put branches on the way of dealing purely with architectural problems. But I'm not quite sure how people would situate their own tracks in terms of that.
I also think it's important to see the digital from further away as part of being from the world of film. I think the way you need to see Columbia and you need to see Bernard in the context of what happened before. Cooper Union, the Institute, the idea of bringing film, Robert Longo, the notion of the body in space. And so if the digital is a way of getting close to, basically architecture always tries to get closer to the way the body works and closer to the way we work with each other. And so the idea of incorporating motion into architecture and film and making film closer to architecture was the first impulse of the 80s, and it has a lot to do with the work of Bernard prior to being a dean at Columbia, and then the work of the digital work. It's a natural extension of that idea of incorporating time and motion in an event in the territory of architecture. And so I see architecture as expanding, and the digital allowing that expansion to go beyond the kind of, like the elevator, but in a new time.
It's interesting to add maybe to that. I was just thinking when Bernard was talking about years 94, 95, that's when I happened to be at Columbia. I mean, I was in Greg's first paperless studio. So I remember very well those days, and we were upstairs. The space was really creative. It's all marble in one corner, Hani Rashid in the other, and then Greg. And it was interesting to see that from the very beginning, as you point out, I think each one of these sections was taking a distinctly different approach. I remember Hani was dealing with images, but two-dimensional images superimposed to each other, animated. So there was movement, more directly film-like. Scott was working a lot with live animation, but of actual tectonic architectural elements. And Greg came to us and put like the big instruction manual on the table and said, learn the software. And it was not mine, because it didn't exist back then. It was called Softimage. And it was kind of an animation movie software. We had no idea what it would do for us, architecture. And it was a very, very interesting moment in time, because particularly for me, coming from Germany, I had already 6-year experience. I was kind of within a modernist mindset, and here we were sort of animating individual spheres and balls colliding with each other and squishing around, and those kinds of things. And I remember I grasped personally the importance of it when we had midterms and finals, and Tschumi was there, and Eisman was there, and Campo and Sylvia, everybody was debating it. And what I thought even back then, what was really interesting, is that the notion of film or animated bodies or rhythmic bodies, as your book is suggesting, can also be achieved through completely different set of techniques. Right? I mean, and to me, of course, just having experienced one in particular, being Greg's model, what I thought was interesting is that therein lie already a concept, or an idea that we back then maybe didn't entirely understood, or me definitely entirely did not understood. It took me probably 3-4 years until I really knew what was going on. But we did it, we followed the techniques, and I think there was definitely a concept that was inherent in the way how we were working through the steps, even though it wasn't clear to us. I'm not sure, looking back, if that's still the same kind of concept. I think it has evolved and spread in web-like, spider web-like conditions in all dimensions, not only 3. But I don't think it was pure experimentation ever.
Don't you think I mean, in a sense, I feel like we're kind of rereading history, looking for an underlying concept, because we don't know what the responsibility of to come up with our own. My work is in the book, but I also wrote a piece called The Subjugation of Concepts. It's so interesting to hear Bernard bring up the precept, concept, affect distinction, philosophical distinction between the 3. But I wonder if in this work that we no longer have the responsibility to be conceptual. And I know this is going to be a flagrantly controversial statement, but architecture historically has had the ability to communicate information. and was one of the primary means with which to communicate information to populations, particularly religiously, for 1900 years, let's say. I think we're still following a model where we think architecture needs to communicate some information. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. All of us have iPhones in our pockets, which are much better at communicating information than architecture. And if you wanted to describe a concept, an architectural concept, it might be better to email everyone once you walk up to the building than to try to distill an idea from the building itself. And I wonder if this work, because of its sheer visual prowess and its unbelievable ability to impact you aesthetically and in terms of affect, like Bernard was saying, like you don't understand it, but you're drawn to it. I think that that's the concept. I think that we're no longer required to come up with a concept. In the same way that the elevator, the inventor of the elevator, didn't say, humankind has always been organized vertically, where the lower levels are for the masses, the piano nobile is for the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the elevator is going to dismantle the previously existing hierarchies of humanity. Like that would have been a great concept if you were in an architecture studio and designed the elevator, right? But really the elevator was designed without a concept in mind. It was a tool to produce a certain activity in architecture. And I think our activity in architecture is more in the aesthetic affect-driven variety than in the functional or conceptual variety. I think that's where our strength in this book lies.
But you can do better than that. If I take, my iPhone, I see images which rely on being incredibly realistic and incredibly sort of precise in their appearance in order to be read, because they are a few inches square. And our world of perceptions has been entirely colored in the last 15 years by the fact that images run the day, run the game. At the same time, one of the things that architecture do is to qualify and define what the game is. So it seems to me that one of the underlying strengths of the work, and again that's why I like the word sensibility, is that the promises that it suggests that it may be something that allows you to grasp what reality is. In other words, in architectural terms, to define what reality is. So what I agree with, the beginning of what you say, then I get nervous when when it takes what I would describe as a passive stance, as opposed to an active one. Namely that, I would say, generally speaking, we, the architects, are the one who define what architecture is. Nobody else. We know, right? We determine where architecture is going. And it's not the world around us that's going to determine, because it's much easier for it to perceive small images and it's not only about the visual. It's also about what things are and where they're going. And so in this sense, I would say, hey, keep going, but try not to give that territory to other people, to politicians, journalists, philosophers, and all that. That part of it is our world, and I think there is the promise of it, and not fully yet, because there are too many things that are still in the making. Technically you can't really build, go down a few blocks away, how much of the digital is used for this building? None, frankly, right? Everything which is built down there could have been built exactly in the same way, 20 years ago. So, hence, there is something else. It's not only about the technique, it's also about saying something about, the society one is in. So.
Definitely, I think that's where you're helping very much in explaining better than I was what this book is about, or what it's pursuing to try to define, try to kind of match where has our perceptual capacity moved because of the digital in general beyond architecture, because of the everyday digital, and the ways in which parallel to that, we've seen an incredible amount of evolution in terms of how, through digital engagement, through more and more construction now, we can now relate to a physical world that is in itself challenging the perception, challenging the understanding of forms. If we were to refer to Peter, who I've worked, Eisenman, in terms of his interest in problematizing the understanding of space to the point that you would be able to force to focus on it or just be challenged forever. The need to set to build into the work the kind of problem that would challenge the perception as a precondition to the spatial manifestation of it. I think that from a different endpoint, this work is kind of contributing to that, in the sense that the amount of information that you have to understand when looking at something, it requires an extra level of attention.
So listening to Rahim speak, I started remembering back in the days when I was applying to grad school, and what was so exciting about Columbia at that moment. This was 3-4 years before the computer, even as a conversation. And it was incredibly exciting for its intellectual project. It had the reputation of being a powerful intellectual endeavor. And also, it was not in reinforcement of the way things were, but in challenged the way things were. It's definitely something that drew me in. And so when the computer arrived, I remember in the second year, I felt slightly confused, because that's actually not what I had come to Columbia for. And so it felt uncertain, because a narrative of technological utopianism is almost antithetical to that intellectual project. So it was kind of a weird hiccup, except for when the paperless studio started rolling. What was so interesting was nobody knew how to use the computer, because nobody wanted to use it in the way that they were designed to be used for. Like soft image for movie animations, nobody wanted to make talking bunnies. It was for an entirely animate architectural process. So it was a complete misuse in a way, similar to the challenge to conceptual structures that might have been in play pre-computer. Similar kind of intellectual challenges I thought were being brought to this new tool. So in the years directly following that, I think what was represented in the book here is not necessarily in conflict with that intellectual project, but more kind of a parallel life that sprouted. Because I do remember these bouncing balls, and in the search for a methodology that was conceptually rooted, we saw some mistakes being made. Like, for example, this bouncing ball represents traffic, or this bouncing ball represents pedestrians, and trace the path, and I got this curved surface, and let's start stuffing programming. And that was clearly the wrong approach. So the methodological approach just seemed to fail, and what I thought was beginning to emerge in those years, like 96 to 2000, was a kind of sublimation of these conceptual structures, and more focus on the results. And beauty or affect, feeling, whatever word we want to put to it, became more a kind of Trojan horse, I think, where the concepts are a little bit more difficult and implicit now, and probably quite diverse, even amongst the group here. And it might just need a little time to play itself out, but I don't think it's against it at all. I think it is there.
So what's the concept?
But I also think that David's point that, prior to the digitalization of GSAPP, there was kind of a deconstruction movement that kind of aimed at the dislocation of certain structures that were very set, and that kind of carried on in the everyday studios and dialogues at Columbia. So it paved the way for when computers came about not to be AutoCAD, because we were already in a project of dislocating with certain ways of understanding production. And so you cannot have, you cannot have soft image and form C unleashed in a group of conforming people and come up with the work that is here. You need the unconforming kind of sense and the digital tools in order to produce the work and the off-prints. Because the thing is that also academia is not static. It takes 3 years for somebody to go through it, and it takes 5 years for somebody that went through it to start teaching. And so what you see is like, boom, it's, Miami and SciArc and everything kind of like what started in the Institute and Cooper Union 20 years later is all over the country and all over a much larger map.
That is, on that note, I wanted to ask Diaz and Galia, who's teaching in Vienna, and his whole formation has happened there. How do you relate to this kind of? I'm not also on the side. I do not think I'm also kind of feeling Hernan a little bit. We don't need to talk so much about necessarily. It's not so much about kind of excavation, memory lane. It's just so important analysis.
I just wait until we start to talk about today.
No, but
I feel like we are way too young to be talking in this terms. I feel like we are arching in 75, 40 years ago. So when we get to now, I'll jump in. Until now, I'm going to sit and look at my older colleagues.
Okay,
talk about their memories.
We woke up a little bit. So Matias, I was going to ask, how does that, for instance, you're acting and teaching and practicing in Europe, and now coming back to teach it, and how does, what kind of rippling do you see that?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I was actually surprised when I saw Eric's invitation. The outline of the invitation being a discussion among Columbia graduates and Columbia teachers, and I was like, wait a minute, I need a graduate.
I want to
he
thought one guy from Yale, so he doesn't get in legal trouble.
Yeah. So I'm sort of
for the record.
That's sort of the suspicious guy here. So that said, what I want to say is that of course we had let's say snippets of information about what's going on here at Columbia, and also it was basically channeled through specific magazines like Arctus, for example, which actually was the first one to publish papers from the Center in German, and all the guys who were teaching at Columbia at the time. And the other source was, funny enough, Columbia Newsline, which we actually got at the Underground. Yeah? So it was lying around, and I recently actually excavated them because I was going to Germany to my dean there to convince him to do a regular paper on the school, and I wanted to bring something along as an example. First thing I thought was just a bunch of Columbia Newsline, and I started reading them. And they're especially from 94, 95. So exactly when the paperless studio actually started. And what was really surprising to me was that I read actually your explanation of the paperless studio that is opening next semester. Yeah? And I was surprised how precise actually your predictions were in terms of what is going to be, let's say, the agenda of the studio in terms of exploration of novel techniques, new possibilities, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that I think that around the time there was a specific feeling of what is possible, although nobody knew exactly where it's going to go. Yeah? This, of course, took some time till it spilled over to Europe. Yeah? And I think one person was really a very special person in the connection between Columbia and the Angevin thing in Vienna is, of course, Greg Lim, when he started teaching in 2003, I think, at the Angevin. And of course, this is continuing now with Hernan also teaching at the Angevin and so on. So I think that what Ferda mentioned before, like this sort of network of specific ideas emerging in different places and repeating basically ideas about techniques, sensibilities, and so on, is something that has become out of what was developed in first place at Columbia, a global phenomenon at the end of the day. So this is basically sort of the outside perspective.
In connection to what Galia was saying about how usually the digital work, and it's kind of or the kind of work that was on the verge of being happening in terms of integration of digital technologies, wanted to also participate on kind of interest response from Bernard with regards to the kind of image movement with regards to the relationship to film, kind of beginning to assess the techniques that are related to film making. And I think that we have someone here that's really been invested with that. I just want to call in Hernan, perhaps about the now, in where he's actually, I think that the work that he's conducted at Columbia, which I initially collaborated with, and then that I think that has been able to kind of make that extreme, kind of take that to an extreme, and also along with that, making kind of a disputed territory between the virtual and the actual dislocation, or kind of dislocation to the point where he begins to claim a new territory of practice, whereby the work, which is really very interested in the image, but very direct way, is actually perhaps producing something that is in that way. So maybe you wanted to kind of like jump into that. Or how do you see there is a connection or disruption?
Well, the way I was talking, and that maybe bring us back to what Mark and Bernard and David were, I want to go back in relation to that, to the conceptual project and all that, because it seems to me, which is the key question. One thing, a couple of things I would advocate, and the two or three are kind of parallel and not necessarily interconnected, but these maybe are the only three things I have to offer to this conversation. One is, I partially agree with Mark's statement about the conceptual problem. I would agree in the sense of, I think it's difficult to claim it, or in the traditional terms of that. But I think for me the fundamental problem has to do much more with the relation of the problem of meaning. I think you can almost push to argue that you can get rid of the conceptual project, but what you cannot get rid of is the notion of the meaning that emanates for that kind of a work. And to me, part of the problem, and I honestly, I have to say, I think the book is fantastic, and I really hope that this is the book that will close the argument in those terms. I think it's important for the discipline to move on and stop doing this separation of digital and all. I think it has been clarified. I think it's important to get it done, to set it up, and so on. But to me, part of the problem is in relation when I was talking with the meaning, I think it has to do with the problem of subjectivity. And I think the part that I think all of us and other people who are working in projects like this, what we owe to the disciplinary discussion is, if we're going to get rid of the conceptual frame in the traditional sense, we need to reconfigure what are the new subjectivity that we are offering through the one the world will be judged. Part of the problem for me is, and I will make myself an very responsible, I think the discipline is still struck in paradigm and subjectivity that belonged to 80 years ago. As much as the postmodern, the deacon, all of them tried as hard as they could, modernism still walk among us at the moment that the subjectivity and meaning get defined. And part of the problem for me to completely liberate to that idea that, okay, we can move from the conceptual project into a different one, we need to redefine what are the subjectivities and what will be the meaning that emanate from that. And the other component to the discussion is, I think this body of work and this logic of work also produce what I would call a notion of architectural fiction, which is more or less what you're referring to, which for me was always the most fascinating aspect. It's not fiction in the notion of science fiction, and it's something that I find myself in discussion having a hard time defining, in the sense of, we know how fiction works in movies or science fiction, but we keep borrowing that, but we never define what does it mean in terms of architecture. And for me, it has to be part of subjectivity, because going back to the iPhone example, and you were talking about the distribution of information. The truth is, I mean, with Steve Jobs dying last week and all the things being on the table, tablets and all the things were on the game for a long time. What he figured it out was to develop like an emotional human relationship between technology. So it's not just that it was, the truth is the iPhone is not the most efficient of them, it doesn't even matter. Something has come to the part which I will say, what for me, people like somebody like Steve Jobs managed to do is to change the subjectivity
I
And
think
so- and
also
so- and
that
change-
a very strong input an object or a series of objects with a very particular sensibility.
Yeah, and I think for me what we owe as a next phase if the project needs to keep going, and I think the project has multiple directions now. It's much more difficult to define than it was 15 years ago. That's why I think it's fun and interesting to remember a little bit and so on, but I understand that the problem is a totally different one, and that's what I was half joking, half serious about the Artican problem, is because I think many of those extreme, sophisticated, radical way of architecture that was produced in one moment, I think they never figured out how to change the subjectivity and the meaning discourse. And I think to me that's the part that still is on the fence, because in one way is, the truth is the digital project, if we can use those very bad terms, is radically associated mostly with the formalist project, which is that's kind of in between lines also, because there's a lot of people who work in the digital domain, but because the work doesn't have such a formalist or formal project with it, it doesn't get cataloged and defined with that. So, to me, these are kind of all gray areas, which I think, at least these are the one I'm interested to see. If we can, after, what, 20 years, let's say, of this body of work, we can change that, because the truth is the cycles of acceleration and evolution of disciplines are getting faster and faster and faster. And to in a very weird way, there is a level of multiple expertise happening, which is making the discussion way more fragmented. And that's why I think that for me the notion of architecture fiction seems to want, I mean, and this is the part I agree with you in the conversation that you and Mark were making, in the sense that I don't think we should give up that. I think we need to figure out how to plan it, and we need to figure out what it is. That's why I call it architecture fiction, not as a parallel reality, but as a way to alter and confront the reality in those terms. Because I think if we don't do that, I think we're not going to get the ball moving. And the last thing I would say is, and I think the relation which with Mark defines as conceptual, I will make it more precise in terms of, I think it's more about the manifesto. I think what I think is being replaced or abandoned is the notion of manifesto as a tool to define an architectural agenda. And at the beginning of this, it still was under that paradigm of manifesto. And I think slowly we're moving away from that, but we haven't figured out what is the mechanism that replaces that, if there is such.
Well, there cannot be a manifesto if you don't have a conceptual. So I'm all for abandoning the conceptual project as a concept and moving to a kind of, sensibility.
Wait, that means that you can't abandon the conceptual project because you abandon any power, any definition. Take, for example, what you just said about the subjectivity. Yes, it has been made a lot in the last few days about the incredible relationship between design, desire, and technology, as brought, jobs, sort of intuition. That deals with the various objects, the various containers, the places where you buy those containers. But did you see the house in which Steve Jobs lived and died? All right? So if you want to bring architecture to the level of the iPad and so on, you better come with concepts that bring this really to grasp reality and bring that subjectivity through on the level of architecture. It's not just going to be purely subjective. It's going to be very, very ruthlessly rational.
I don't.
Do you think?
I agree with the analogy that keeps coming up here, and I love the analogies. Jobs was able to produce an affect for Apple that created almost this loyalty that no one can really identify why. It's partially about design. It's most significantly it's about marketing. And I don't know, architecture doesn't have a marketing component at the moment that can rival anything in contemporary
It's
culture.
much deeper than marketing.
No, but it's also not deep, it's not superficial enough. What we do and our conceptual intent is so intellectually charged and so indecipherable by the general public. What Steve Jobs did was with marketing and Apple was make affect so immediately decipherable and absorbable and consumable. All we're doing up here when we're talking about concepts and presenting our work in conceptual terms is alienating everyone except us.
Hey, come on. Steve Jobs' concept was unbelievably clear. right? He doesn't have to state it.
The concept was to generate an affect for a product.
No, it's far from
I don't think it's,
yeah.
But
I think the ability, don't underestimate the technology.
What's the concept?
The
Like we're talking about a
technological,
critical concept for Apple? What's
To
the
extend
concept?
the body.
the
The concept
the
is to extend.
technological
That was the
advance.
concept, and that's what comes through, and that's what gets everyone into an Apple store. Is
I-
they say, I want to
I think,
extend my body.
I think the idea that the computer becomes smaller, I mean, the first big step was to make it a computer a personal thing, and then to make it smaller and portable, and smaller and portable, and smaller and portable.
So what's the architectural version of that?
I have no idea, but what
That's what I'm saying, we haven't found it.
But what I'm telling you is that it's not.
Hold on,
That's
the-
exactly what
I
I'm
want
saying.
to clarify.
It's not-
I want to clarify something before it goes out of control. I mean, as Mark Will is still here, I mean, and he clearly put in, when we have a discussion in the very finale, I feel very comfortable being on the loser team always. So I'm not advocating for a model of architectural success when I'm talking about. I'm talking about, and I'm advocating for new subjective meaning, discipline and cultural value. I personally, I couldn't care less how successful that became or not in relation to consumption. Myself, I know I'm in the minority.
Right, but what I'm
I don't-
saying
I
is
don't
that
believe you.
marketing is the act of.
I know, I care about my own success, not about the discipline of success.
You can't say that.
When I'm trying to say that, I think there are two different discussions. My main argument these days is the discipline and the profession are they are more apart now than they've ever been, and I think it's very difficult to bring them back together. I think, and to me, if we want to keep evolving, we need to figure it out how the discussion between profession and discipline became a more dynamic one, because it seems like they are in parallel tracks with no possibility of interaction.
You underestimate yourself.
Yeah,
You're doing
I-
much better than that. I go back to the fact that eventually you are the one who define what the direction of architecture is. And
You
it's
can't
not
do
the
that,
other
they're
way around.
subjective.
I agree with that.
Right.
You can't do that, they're subjective.
Correct, absolutely.
But it seems that a lot of the, I mean, to me, the conversations, to me, allude to kind of almost like are crying for a kind of delivery of what it is that we do, a kind of, just trying to put some other term. But this, I can't go back to Steve Jobs, but rather something that would actually be able to.
Galia and bringing the idea of manifesto. The manifesto was about communication. Right?
But now it reads comic.
But
Like
what
if
was
you
the
read a
difference
manifesto
back
today,
in
it's
the
like.
day? I mean, I'm not sure. You said something interesting to me about the house that Steve Jobs actually inhabits. And,
Hey,
said
Ali, we
that-
need somebody
that's
else
a
here.
lack-
Come in.
That's a lack
We
of,
don't have enough. Come in.
that's a lack of concept.
Come to sweat with us.
And I don't know
I don't
if
care
that's
about your
really
training.
You know, I don't think the problem is concept in terms of, I think we're talking about different things here. One is about the progression of the argument being enhanced through concept or not being enhanced. The other is people like Steve Jobs, who do very creative work with objects, would ever want to live in a house that's like an iPad of some sort. And I think what you were suggesting is that it's a matter of us finding a way of conceptualizing what we do in order to make that happen.
In order to trigger desire for something like
So
you
the
were working on.
The
right?
concept is creating the desire.
But I mean,
No, the concept there can be so many, there's not
But-
one
but
concept,
Bernard,
there are many concepts.
Wouldn't you agree that, I don't know if I want to do this because I make a living in relation to this, but that the academic and the School of Architecture, consciously or not, have been helping this idea that convincing architects to give up power in terms of how they think?
I hope not.
No, I hope not, I just said it,
You know.
in the light of the results.
No, again, what has certainly happened in the last, and it's not going back to the history, it's just knowing what has happened in the last generation, your generation, is that for a long time what was happening in the school was simply to learn what was being done out there in practice.
That changed.
And that has completely changed. It's rather going the other way around. There are certain things which are happening in the school which have an influence on practice. Again, not down in ground zero, but a lot of other places. So at that moment it means that what you're doing with your group of student is defining certain bits and pieces of what the future might be. And that's...
No, I completely agree with that. What I'm talking about is more my concern is that when you start to see corporate architecture easy moving into absorbing the influence that comes from a Campo much more experimental, research-based environment, there is something in that transition, in that translation, in those relationships, that to me is kind of a problematic. And I don't think that's what I'm saying. And I agree with you, I think we need to figure out a way to don't give away the power and how you define that, which I would argue that probably happens in every discipline. I'm not saying that architecture is alone in that, but clearly in architecture is one of the becomes actually easier to move between those territories. So what I'm trying to say is how there is a kind of a, where is the possibility to rethink how you reclaim the power for intellectual thinking, for disciplinary way, that it will have a direct correlation with the professional. And it's not the filter one.
I wanted to actually extend this question both to Galia and to David, given that it's known that the school over the last few years is reshaping its discourse into kind of making of this particular something that connects or wants to veer closely to the notion of delivery or the kind of notion of rethinking what could potentially be the concept, or a kind of conceptual project. So I wanted to inquire into that, or how, even in the case of David, how do you see that the digital technologies participating in that? Has it been reframed in some sort of way, or just purely displaced? I just wanted to know.
Well, yeah, I mean, the kind of trends and terms that resonate with me are like Bernard's introduction that in the beginning there was actually a diversity of digital approaches, and it may not have been possible at that moment to say there was a certain coalescence around a moment that's I think, as everyone has observed, described very well in the book. So maybe there was a diversity in the beginning, then there became a kind of convergence of approaches and techniques. But I think, and as David Roy was saying, there's now a diversity again. And I think, it's a diversity of concepts. So the idea of like there being a concept related to technology doesn't resonate with me because there are so many concepts and because technology is so embedded in our working models and in some ways in every studio, it seems to me, at Columbia these days. So a term that is, kind of comes to mind for me is ubiquitous computing. Kind of for two reasons, because one, ubiquitous computing is a different kind of computing than the digital that was taking over Columbia at those important moments. But two, because of the term ubiquitous, meaning like everywhere and so embedded that it's kind of impossible to tease out in some ways. And for people who are wondering what I mean by ubiquitous computing, it's generally the idea that computers are becoming smaller and less expensive and more networked and disappearing into things like our clothes and our street lights and also the woodwork of our architecture. And when that happens, it kind of opens up entirely new ways of thinking about what's possible with the computer. And I think maybe there's an analogy to be made with, if that's the term for computer hardware becoming so ubiquitous that it's everywhere. Sensors are tiny and they're embedded in concrete now. I think maybe there's ubiquitous software as well. I mean, it's like, it's everywhere and it does so many things. And it did in '94 as well, but I think there's been like a kind of tipping point in the number of things that it does and that architects do with it. And if there were like 3 or 4 things it could do well in '94, now there are like 15, and the number of combinatorial possibilities is like billions. And so, just to kind of spin this out, and this is just kind of a brainstorm, but maybe the role of architects in technology, and I think I see this a little bit in studios and in practice, is designing links. So you work in your one technology, but you have to design interoperability, and you have to design the way that your technology plays with other technologies, and that becomes a super important role. In other words, the people graduating from schools who have technological abilities that are very valued, it's like writing custom script that will connect one firm's digital model to another firm's structural evaluation model and feed feed that data back and forth, or some architect's vision of a form to the very specific digital fabrication method.
Yeah, but everything you're describing is totally separate from what you described as the architect's vision of the form. Like, I worry that the technology we're all relying, now, the opposite of that, the technology that the entire architectural world is relying on is completely divorced from the technology that we're talking about. And Bernard mentioned that Ground Zero isn't using any of this technology, but it is entirely computationally based. Because everything in the world of computation where it meets architecture is in the world of efficiency.
Yeah, but
and we're not talking about
I'm saying something
here.
else. What is being done down there could have been done 20 years ago.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
And now.
But it couldn't have been done as cheaply.
Possibly.
That's where the computer's being used, and that's why we're
Yeah.
losing battle here.
No, we're not. I think we're having
Look
a winning.
outside.
No, we're having a winning battle on the long run.
Okay.
And I'm going to, we talked about concept or not. When David Benjamin talks about biocomputing, and you did in your introduction to your studio a few weeks ago, you are onto a new concept. It's nothing to do with subjectivity, even though it has subjective, effects. But the point is defining certain areas of research through an analysis which is highly, highly rational and highly, yes, indeed, conceptual. And I think that's what gives you power. It's about being active, about defining what the world around you is. And nobody else is doing it, right? It's up to us to do it. And that's why I always get anxious about the subjective discourse, because it can fall, not always, but it can fall into a so-called passive discourse. Take a little further down, right? Zuccotti Park. I tell you, it looks from the outside highly subjective and highly, spontaneous. In reality, it's highly organized. It was planned several months ago, and it's highly ordered and organized. So those guys know exactly what they're planning on. It's not at all. It's something which is strategic. And the issue of being strategic about what one does, I think it's crucial, and I would not underestimate it. I was just having a sort of quickie with Hernan. I do believe that what you are exploring is actually a form of strategy in order to grasp the world, and don't abandon it. Don't take it purely as as an effect of subjectivity. It's far more than that.
I also want to say that you can see the Occupy Wall Street as a continuous with the situationist movement. So this idea that Hernan is saying, the things that were done by Archigram may not have been resolved by Archigram, but may have been resolved by other people. And I think you need to see, as David was saying, not a pipe, but a kind of radial gradient that goes from the corporate. One of the things that we need to assume is that architects have a lot of power. You cannot leave people like Norman Foster out of the picture. That's a one-generation firm. And it may not be the person that we like the most, but it's a colleague, and we need, in that kind of way in which the profession is affirmed, will be really.
But why architecture need to be defined colleagues like that? Why architecture cannot be like medicine? A
No,
surgeon is never
but-
there to talk to a skin doctor.
But I'm responding to one claim that you made, that architects do not have power, and I think that that's a fallacy.
I would say the architects I'm interested in.
Well, that's another cop-out, because you are it's kind of a promotional.
Do you really believe that architecture has the power not the developer? Do you really believe that?
I
Yes.
think
Yeah.
that
I respect that. I'm not saying that, but I don't agree with that statement.
I think there is a kind of a personal aspiration that may be different from the actual acknowledgement of power. Power as being a silent movement of things in space, and so you cannot deny the immense power of architecture and the possibilities of any one of us to going through the cracks. It's just if you don't acknowledge that, you are not really taking full advantage of
That's
the
an entirely
conceptual
historical
position.
argument.
Huh?
That's entirely a historical argument. That's not.
I think all my arguments are always going to be historical, and all my arguments are.
Don't you find that like profoundly depressing that our influence and power has to come through the cracks and sneaky manipulation and 1%?
No, there was
Wait,
the list. The
so
list.
it's the definition of what architecture is. You're a generalist, right? You deal with plumbing, with you know, sort of expansion drawings. You deal with rooms. You deal with budget. You deal with zoning. You deal with whatever, hundreds of things. You're the only one who actually, in the whole chain of command that leads to a building, that has an overview of all the parts, right? The developer doesn't, the banker does not, the contractor does not. You're the only one, right? You're generalist because you're not very good at any of it, but you have an overview, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing about, you know, history. I, again, get worried about saying they are different kind of architects. I'll give you a historical example. There was a fantastically talented architect about my own age. His name, you all know him, is Leon Krier. He had very strong beliefs. He's superbly, you know, skillful. But he had a sort of disagreement with the architecture out there. And he said, he had that great statement, he said, it is because I'm an architect that I do not build, right? The problem is, it doesn't, you know, you put yourself against a fence. And you have at one moment to say, hey, I have to deal with what I determine, and that's why I insist not that you have to build to be an architect, but you have to determine what you consider what architecture is. And ultimately, there are very important architects who have only written books. And that's perfectly fine, right? So it's about, the great thing about what we do is that we can define what we do. There's no, you know, in a sense, there are certain disciplines where you don't have that much room. You know, if you're mathematicians or if you are a politician, the range is much narrower. The range of architecture is huge.
Well, actually, let me follow up on something, because I'm the only person here probably that knows Leon Krier on a personal basis, and I've taught studios with him. And I can say that he's by far one of the most influential people in architecture today. Which sounds completely asinine because it appears as if his career completely evaporated in 1980. Leon Krier was largely a founder of the New Urbanism movement. New Urbanism is turning into the Congress for New Urbanism, which has probably had more of an impact on the American landscape than anything anyone in this room has done or studied in the last decade.
Certainly in Miami.
Certainly in Miami, where a hotbed of it is. Sort of. Leon, do your architecture scheme, or not yours?
Yeah,
your
We have a great. I think
point.
FIU was invented in order to counteract Leon Krier influence on places like that.
So I'm not saying I'm supportive of it. I'm saying it's a fact that the reason Leon is so influential is because his architecture aligns perfectly with what the economy, the American economy wants, which is pitched roofs and small neighborhoods. And because there's an alignment between his architectural desire and the economics of it, there's a huge change happening in the United States in planning. Our argument here is not aligned with any architectural agenda, which is why we're not seeing this stuff anywhere except in books. It's very small and very far between exceptions.
Wait.
So I'm saying, I feel that the concept or marketing is something else is needed as a vehicle to align what we do with the economic situation that exists out there in the world.
Can I add something?
I'm not saying that none of us are building. I'm saying that none of us are responsible for, in any way, changing the billions of hectares of development which are going up in the United States on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's fine, but let me add something to that. Like two things. Like first of all, I think there's actually a twofold process going on. Okay, the one side being what you see in this book, the other one being the corporate companies using the most advanced computational tools to build whatever they build. I'm not going to judge their architecture now. It's only about the processes they're using. And they probably are
That's entirely the problem. We're talking about the processes and not what's
Can I finish, man?
No, but
yes.
I totally disagree with
It's
you.
okay. It's fine. It's fine. But the point is, the point is that you just have to snag that. You have to just understand what they're doing and make it your own and make your own architecture.
But that's a really naive argument in the face of billions of dollars of development.
No, stop thinking about that.
Watch out about who is doing the naive argument. Sure, the $1 billion being used by relatively uninteresting, set of circumstances, and probably the very people you don't want to vote for. I'll take another example. Jürgen Meyer in some Spanish city, right, does an extraordinary public space using exactly those tools, right? And I'm sorry that your average Florida developer has not understood that, right? So it's absolutely possible. So
I agree. And the other thing is, we were talking so much about marketing, and that of course it is true that no developer understands what we're talking about. It's also naive to think they would, yeah? But the point is that this book is for you something that we can do, which is seductive images. And that's something that is a marketing tool.
That is a market. I'm not advocating, I'm actually absolutely not advocating for an architecture that stops at the image, which is, I think, what we're becoming a generation content to be.
But on that, I agree.
Robin Evans describes architecture as a
I mean, I want to defend the image a little bit because it gets such a bad report lately. And the image, I mean, we tend to talk a lot about geometry and all that, but the real vehicle of the revolution, it was more the production of the funky, shiny images. And the idea that the images became a new tool for the production, a whole vocabulary and a whole ideology in architecture, it's not a minor thing. The question is, what are the consequences of that when it started to become like a project? Like, my personal interest was the very few occasions when I had to build something, I want the thing to look like the render, not the other way around. Because I'm obsessed with that, the construction of the fiction, because I think that, honestly, if we go to the notion of power and so on, is one of the moments I feel the most empowered by what the tools and what they allow you to do. So I have no problem with the notion of image as being in the vehicle for the production of architecture, because, by the way, it was always like that. I mean, if we go to Palladio, the reason why we love Palladio are the drawings. The drawings are way better. The buildings were great, don't get me wrong, but the drawings are even better, because they have that notion of that level of abstraction. Then I think, so I would not be so gentle, so bad with the poor image. I think image is amazing. I mean, without the image, we wouldn't have changed many of these
it's unsurprising. Columbia, the discussion is once again about power. And to some degree, I think it's a disagreement about the right tactic for empowering architecture more. And I think the traditional danger of looking towards subjectivity is that's actually the way things were before the 60s. That's when PR was invented, when marketing was invented, and throughout the 40s and the 50s. It was a kind of giant project to engineer subjectivity for consuming certain goods, right? So that kind of got beautifully blown up in the 60s, right? So at this point, can we say, well, the way to maintain an emancipatory program is through multiplying subjectivities? We're talking about multiple subjectivities. And
I would talk about multiple ontologies or something.
yeah, I know.
Because the argument is the modernism that reduced over time to subjectivity. Right? I'm not against about the notion of architecture and power and claiming that. I'm just saying that the structure of power and it still gets determined, what determines the logic of architecture is actually a fairly obsolete notion of architecture and power.
You know, this morning I was reading this article about the Republican candidates, right? And when they got to Romney, I thought it was hilarious. So that he's unelectable because he's too much of a technocrat, they say. And I thought that was fascinating. Yeah, that might be part of it.
I'm serious.
But here's what the article was trying to compare was versus somebody like Perry, who's almost entirely about Africa. Zero content, nothing but Africa. Right? So, and this is the world. This is the nature of power to enlarge it. Marketing is not a trivial thing. It's an insidious, powerful thing.
That's
right.
What
so if it's power that we want to acquire, we got to come
But
back.
I would disagree that Rick is about African zero content. I think it's very bad content.
So would you say, David, that this is...
No,
It's irrelevant in the face of his charisma, in the same way.
Well, I'm kind of on the fence. I'd like to take a middle position on it because I don't think just grabbing power is necessarily such a good thing. If it's done as a frontal assault, I think that's just not good. I mean, the people, the so-called people on the other side of the window, they're not dummies. They understand the power they have. They understand the usefulness, the instrumentality of affect, and they're fully aware that architecture is in many ways the last of the professions to really understand the power of these kinds of tools. And I don't think that's such an outright winning argument to say that's the way to become more powerful. Just to engage these regimes.
I think we have to address it in some capacity.
I think we do have to address it.
Ignore it.
My comment was
I agree with that.
maybe you can think of somewhere else. But my point was in relation to, I think the whole digital architectural discussion, they became, maybe it's our own fault to understand, too much reduced to the notion of technique and so on. What I was trying to say is, I think for all the different voices and everybody raising an opinion, I would say that we should not discard any of them. The question is how this body of work start to relate with that in the same innovative terms that they did to techniques, methodology, computation, and so on. My whole argument was that I think there was all these bunch of new things that the way that they relate and communicate with the other aspects that come to the disciplinary discussion, I think we are doing the wrong pair. We haven't, my feeling is it hasn't been innovative enough in relation to shift, in relation to politics, power, social structure, economy, all that. That's all I'm saying.
I think there's also, what resonates to me without putting the name out there, and I think Eric, you actually did mention in the beginning, is sort of the whole discussion of autonomy or not, which is obviously tied to a lot of the way how some of us at least operate and think. And I think it seems to me that we're still not getting a lot of that kind of conversation. If architecture is an autonomous project that allows us to do experimentation and move the discipline forward, well then, what are the mechanics within that process that allow us to engage outside of itself, how it's structured in societies and so forth. And it seems we're still kind of within that debate, which I find...
As much as I love the autonomous project, and I would like to think that we start with that, I really don't think you can do it anymore. Even if you want,
I agree.
It doesn't happen in those countries.
But don't you hear that the conversation is still going on in the way?
But that's what I'm saying. I think we need to change the relation to meaning and the relation to how we reframe that.
Right.
Because I think it's a bogus argument. I mean, for a start, the tooling, the techniques that we're using, whatever it even belong, they didn't emanate, it didn't came from the autonomy of the discipline in any case.
Neither did they come from architecture at all.
Exactly. So already from the get-go, even though it's masquerade because the formalism has belonged to the autonomous project, it really from the get-go was, it didn't, in my view, I don't think it belonged to that anymore. Even though we keep insisting to, and again, I'm guilty as charged of that, because I was attracted to that idea because my interest in the formalist project. But the truth is, he operates at a different level. And I think those are, to me, the things that, if there is a next book, I think it's about that. It's about the decoding. What does it mean that in relation to the larger problem of the architectural agenda, and we go beyond those notions?
It seems to me that something that David was saying, David Benjamin, about kind of, and one could read as a kind of dissipation in a positive way, and also understand as a kind of loss, right? But a kind of dissipation of the kind of concentrated efforts of technique towards a kind of more insertion into the kind of different compartments of the practice that can actually give you a different understanding of the actual project. It seemed that that was an opportunistic, an interesting moment where we kind of counter a lot of the arguments here. But on the other hand, does it really need to relinquish a kind of a project that is out engagement.
To be used by others. It was built with these links that I was talking about. So the people doing the project, you know, designed it to be picked up by others, like very deliberately, in a kind of open source mentality, and that software is really open source. So maybe there's something powerful about that, because the people who wrote processing, in a sense, are writing a huge amount of the visual environment being produced, not only by architects, but by a lot of other artists right now. You know, even data people and the people at IBM who are designing the smart cities, which might be a rival to new urbanism in some ways. You know, it's a major movement, a force to be reckoned with. So I think, you know, there's just something interesting there. I don't know that I will make the argument that all architects using tools should design them in ways to be disseminated as widely as possible. But I think there's an interesting message there in the ability of one technique, and I do this, you know, deep and off the deep end techniques is all of this stuff, to design the links for it to be reusable, open source, and engage in kind of DIY.
I have tremendous admiration for this kind of project, but also like how Linux was brought into being, etc. There are multiple open source models, you know, project, etc. However, I don't think it's a pervasive model. The pervasive model in business, in the world economy, is proprietary and governed by patents. That's where the big money is. And the open source project has been the intellectual resistance to that world as a way to break that world down. And so I don't think it's, one, necessary to claim that it's everywhere already. And two, I think it's important to just hang on to the values of this project, to make it more explicit as a project of resistance too.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
Yeah. In a way.
But I also think that there's a kind of a formal aspect of every first wave. Like if you take the abstract expressionists, they're much more than formalists. You know, Pollock, it's much more than formalists. Changed a lot of things, and Rauschenberg would not be possible without Pollock, but it's not abstract expressionism. And Warhol would not be possible without Pollock and abstract expressionism, but it's not abstract expressionism. So I think every new whatever comes from a kernel that has an identifiable, maybe unobtainable form, and then developed in many multiple ways. And so I think that, you know, any question, you know, are you relinquishing the formal aspects or this or that? It's nothing to do. It's just, that was stage one. And then the spread of this bending condition takes many other situations into account. And form is just one of the venues, not necessarily it.
But that's what I think, for me, the key word to keep going back, at least in my head, is at the beginning was sensibility. Because at the end of the day, what you know is technology and techniques will keep changing and will keep shifting. And you have to keep adapting, and the whole system in itself is hard to correct. Like, if you look around the most progressive and interesting schools in the world, there is a desire in the world coming from the students of a lot of different logic of contamination. It's like all of them seem fed up with the fake model of perfection that the digital project established for 20 years, and now everybody's throwing anything else that they can multiple software interactions, but from map testing, you name it. So to me, that to me is a very powerful, that's what I was talking about from the image as a very powerful thing, because if you think historically, if we talk about architecture, and architecture with capital A, I mean, the tradition in relation to religiosity and all that, was to try to achieve a sense of perfection through very imperfect techniques of design and construction. And then suddenly computation came on board, and suddenly you can really design in a perfect way. And now there is a desire to try to create sort of fake imperfection out of these perfect techniques. And to me, that's what, for me, is the most interesting part now. That is, these are becoming almost such a given. So the notion of sensibility becomes really important, because at the end of the day, is what distinguishes the work, and what is what add value to the work, whatever else we do with that, because if we think about comparing to music, like, I don't know, in the 80s with electronic music or the beginning of it, yeah, today we can look back and you can be Depeche Mode, you can be Erasure. Both of them were using similar technologies and similar techniques. One produced music that is sustainable over time because it developed a sensibility that can keep evolving, and the other one produced whatever it was that you think it produced. So, yes, good for you. But the thing is, but my point is, I think the notion of sensibility is an important one because I think sensibility is not an intuition, it's a highly methodological thing, something that you construct. And to me, that's the part that, especially when we have in front of the audience of the students, I think that's the challenge. And I would argue the ethical responsibility that they have is not to take this as a given or something, oh, it's established, or not to look as an historical thing, is to see it as an animal that keeps changing all the time. But there wasn't, for me, the most thing is that they're going from imperfection to perfection and do the vice versa. That's a gigantic shift of paradigm, which I don't think we completely grasp what are the consequences. And I think it's too early to say, to tell you the truth. I mean, if you look at physics and whatever, it takes a lot of years. Tiny thing, I think after 40 years old, something gigantic happens. So, I don't know, that's why I think that everybody, to an extent, they are so diverse opinions, because the question is, the thing is becoming very powerful, so what do we do with it? And there are many ways to go. So that, I will keep arguing about the notion of sensibility and the notion, which is not a style, I'm not talking about that, I'm talking about to understand a logic of work. Maybe logic is a way to replace, if we want to replace concept, maybe it should be logic, the one that comes into place the traditional sense of concept, maybe.
Yeah, and talking about tools and concepts and after something that I found really a surprise in the past 3 years or so is that the more conceptually oriented architects seems to have been gravitating more towards parametric tools or BIM, whereas the more sensibility-oriented practices are moving away from emphasis on tools altogether. And I find that very interesting. Like we've had discussions about some recent work doing parametrics, but it is very telling that this potential of the computer to embody a methodology is connecting with more conceptual projects. Most of the people in this book are esoteric in the use of the tool. I mean, it's not a digital computer book here at all. It's really about the resistance to something, right? Because in the main line of computer software, the movement is more towards the elimination of the architect altogether by embodying expertise in the tool itself. That's why they're modeling software more on expert systems than on purely geometric terms. That's dangerous.
In connection with that, an anecdote in the making of, you prior to making the book, making the conference that originated the book, in Miami, I first had a conversation with Terence Riley to do the conference and also to do an exhibition at Miami Art Museum when he was the director there. And he immediately, his mind went to comparing this to the, potentially, if you were to do a show there, to the Decon show. And I was just thinking, what is this guy thinking? And then, in that way, I find it even compared to the point that Galia brought earlier on about how actually the work was really going against the kind of trends, the kind of work that intellectual project that predated the emergence of digital technology at Columbia. It was actually really, there was a discourse of resistance built in there. And I don't think that there's, I mean, the work that we do has kind of, or the people do it, that I'm part of it, has not necessarily any kind of intellectual project as such, but yet, I thought that was really interesting what you just said about the fact that really it's much more about the resistance, but kind of finding the ways in which one can resist the kind of systems built into the software, kind of the build-up of this kind of alternate uses, but kind of in a way, the individualization of the work has to do with that particular build-up, which tends to define the different approaches. And yet it continues to be really difficult to put anybody in this, fortunately to have you in the same room today, and also to have everybody in this book. I was completely surprised by how people were readily supporting and being willing to be included alongside you, alongside you, and how this book grew into that. And I continue to be surprised in seeing the work now that is something else in its book, and how diverse it is, how very different it is. And yet I think that the one thing that maybe brings something common is what you just said about the fact that it's even kind of counter-resting kind of assumptions about systems, how systems can and should work, so that it really resists a kind of model of efficiency, and yet, you know, uses the best of. It has to kind of transition into using the best of, and that's why I still think that it's kind of really interesting hearing how David now, as a past effect of this, or maybe some kind of other trajectory that's leading there, is kind of assuming that really it's in the kind of those loopholes of breaking down the problems where there are some opportunities, right, for the kind of digital work to continue evolving to something that doesn't even need the term digital in front of it.
Let me ask one thing. In your book, there is an example which is Enrique Miralles and Benedetta Taglieri. And Enrique and Benedetta have done a certain type of work and a certain type of sensibility before the tool, before the digital.
That's why it's there.
And the thing in Glasgow, right? Parliament, is actually done with very different tool, and in the back of the book you bring Victor Horta, and you make certain parallels with someone else. And then with Benedetta and Enrique, it means that eventually they extend what they had been doing before they had the tools in terms of doing things one step further with the digital. In other words, it's exactly the opposite of someone who maybe like you starts with the, the image and what you have produced thanks to the machine, but then may or may not, it's your decision, will turn it into a built form. In other words, the question is which is the chicken, which is the egg? Is the sensibility leading to this type of work, or this type of work leading to this sensibility? And I have no answer. I'd like to hear from
I have no clue, but in the case of the work of Diaz, also Diaz with Pinos, who's one of the works that is there, in Valencia, I think that there is something quite intriguing in that they really had to develop an entire repertoire of how to draw these things and how to. So I think the desire, the sensibility is very much omnipresent, and then comes the need to kind of evolve that into graphic constructions that lead to the physical.
This is my personal view. It doesn't matter which way it goes. That's irrelevant. But the question is what you want to do with it.
I think in relation to that, generational is a thing that comes to mind. I can only respond for myself. In myself, I will be the case of the first one, because my education in Argentina, working for Enrique, and so on, I came from that trajectory in which these tools were a way to, like esterals, it was basically to take already a notion that you had a way to work, and this expanded to limit. Now, I think people that now, from the first semester and the first year, they work with it, I don't think that they even think 2 minutes about that question. It's just embedded in the logic. I don't know. When I was in school in Argentina, it was a fundamental debate about how to build curve, compass versus French curves, and that was it was a huge ideological debate. To which one you will operate. So I think the things are a little bit there and so on, and I think you have to do more with a larger ambition. And I think there are architects who operate in a more analytical way, in which the sensibility is a byproduct of that. Peter would be an example that came to that. Another guy, I would think, Peter thought in a very digital way before he was working on computers. I was 1 to 11, 1 to that, he was that. And I think that people get away around it, which, for example, somebody like Enrique, people will think that he was incredibly gestural, but he was. But at the same time, he was incredibly precise and methodological about it. So I think at the end of the day, it's what you're saying. I think it doesn't matter which one is one or the other. But I think it's important for yourself to understand from which side you're operating, because I think you have different consequences on how you operate.
But I also think Herman's right in, especially for this room of people, that I think we're past the point where we can justify the work by virtue of its process.
Yeah.
And also that the work will become different. Like when you see the Talk to Me show, that where technology is so bio, I know that, and it's so embedded in the way machines work and relates to body, the image has changed. And it has some etymology with this, but it diverges and it multiplies.
Yeah, I think there needs to be.
Eric, I think we need to move to a question and answer.
Yeah. We should definitely do that.
Someone's raising their hand.
We should give people a chance to ask questions.
Please, yeah. Questions.
Like one.
Questions and hopefully answers.
Someone who's had a little bit of work into the UNPT office actually worked a little bit with the Shanghai Expo Pavilion, and that's where the scripting was really used as a tool. It was merely something that was sitting in fast production. And when it came to design, it was kind of perceived as a hands-on work. But I wonder if this scripting and communications into the new technologies can help us think of how do we really detach architecture or use architecture to detach us from the social political context we're in. For instance, we talk about architects versus development today. That's because we live in the capitalist world. Centuries ago, there were no developers, and architecture was still worse off for that reason. So, how do we use maybe this new technology to question the actual social political context we're in?
That's another symposium right there.
Oh, come on. You can answer.
I'm talking enough.
Who do you want? Who do you want to
Yeah, that's all right. I have a pretty quick answer just because I talk a lot. I'll answer. I've been looking. I'm working right now because I can't get architectural projects. I'm working on an outfit for Lady Gaga. So I've been looking at the history of fashion and how fashion turns over. We have this contemporary idea that fashion turns over so incredibly quickly in our contemporary society with the internet and the seasons. Fashion's so fast. And then I was reading about Renaissance fashion and realized that they didn't think of things like shirt and pants. They didn't have those kind of like constructs for them. They thought of things in terms of like sleeve, lapel, buttons. So a nobleman would wake up in the morning and say, we're going to put together this sleeve with this corset, with this lapel, with this buttons. So fashion in Renaissance Florence, per se, changed daily because some fancy woman would wear this type of lapel with this type of corset with this type of button. So we take for granted that our world is a certain way, but in fact, there's completely different ways of thinking about it. So thinking everything that we're doing is novel and new, and computers are everywhere, and everything is changing, I don't think is as interesting as thinking of architecture in a new way, in that same way that thinking of fashion in a way that was compartmentalized by bits and pieces as opposed to whole things. What I'm saying is that's more of an important idea than the technology that allows you to make everything and put it all together. But there needs to be a conceptual shift in architecture, even though that's probably the wrong word, conceptual shift in architecture that puts us in alignment with some sort of new idea about what the architecture of the future is going to be. In the same way that the woman who woke up and said, instead of putting on a shirt, I can put on these sleeves with this lapel, it's a completely different way about thinking about the social aspect, about how fashion engages with the everyday population. And we're in desperate need of a dramatic shift in the way we think about architecture that puts it in dialogue with the social, but more importantly, I think, economic realities of what are going out there in the real world. I think we're still living in a, old mentality of shirts and jeans, when we should be thinking in a much more fluid and interesting way about how architecture engages.
I would adopt it.
Do we have one more question?
One more?
I'm done.
Oh. Say by
what role do you feel mechanization has in this whole process? For example, this digital architecture has almost a parallel journey that animation had, where they went first from photographing stills and then putting them in a row together and seeing how it changed over time. And then eventually that led to the movie camera and to really mimicking realism. And so this digital architecture, how do you feel that mechanization plays a role in it?
I'd like to know what Hernan thinks about
that. Well, I personally think that one of the architecture's strength and weakness in parallel is they have this capacity to move slower than most of the other disciplines. And I think that's a strength for architecture, not necessarily a weakness. So if you really think what you're talking about, it happened at the end of the 19th century. So it took architecture roughly 100 years to catch up to that notion. But I think the medium and the specificity of the discipline is something that, as much as we like to think that there's no boundaries, the boundaries are there. And as much as we like to think that, so my sense is in relation to that is, I think architecture will take a more dynamic relation with the construction of the design project. But I don't think it's going to be so linear and so obvious in the way how the photography evolved into film. I don't think it will happen because you can trace through the history of architecture. Architecture went through serious transformation like the one that you're talking about photography into film. And actually certain principles of essence of the architecture never change. And to me that is one of the most powerful things and it what makes architecture so different than, let's say, any of the other arts or creative disciplines. It doesn't have that capacity to change so fast. It doesn't have that capacity to become so malleable. So it requires different logics and requires multiple forces to come into play. And don't get me wrong, I think an artist paints and he wants to paint and then he needs somebody to buy it and so on. But the artist, when he's painting or she's painting, they're just painting and then they hope for another. In architecture, from the get-go, you have multiple forces. So I don't think that, as much as we would like, I think part of the transformation of the discipline doesn't come only from the interiority of the technique and so on. It requires a bunch of other things. But I would argue also that there are series of transformations that are very evident in the canons by Pueblo. If you look at the generation of people like Bernard, and I will talk more about the people in Labour, the one I'm close, like Tom Main and those guys, they build the whole logic of career, doing the small houses and renovations and so on. Then in my younger generation, build experimentation through installations of museums and other things that have much more dynamic and possibilities that those architecture experiments becomes closer to what you were working your studio in the computer. So, I mean, I'm not giving you an absolute answer, which is probably what you were looking for, but I think it's embedded in the speed of the discipline, which is way slower than most of the other disciplines. But I think that for me is a fantastic thing about architecture. I think that the construction of the memory that the discipline has is undeniable.
Actually, a little bit surprised at the two questions. I don't know if this is a fair sampling of the audience. Is both essentially about tools and about technology, because
well, we're talking about that in relation to social.
Yeah, I mean, reconfiguring society through technology, I think that's one project, and the subject matter of the book, reconfiguring society, or maybe having a more indirect influence and power through sensibility, is, I think they're two completely different projects. So.
As somebody who's running this technology as architects who have this vision and the power that nobody else, even one person, developers, the city authority, etc. has, and how can we use our technologies that spend so much time developing to actually control this in a different way or address it?
Get good at it. Get good at it. I'm serious.
I mean, usually architects are the ones hired to do that. We're usually brought in to do something else.
All right, I think you should all have a drink because you've earned it. But first, a round of applause. Thank you.